We will get started in just a moment, waiting on our ranking member. He is almost here, and we'll get started as soon as he gets here. Hearing on jobs for wounded warriors, increasing access to contracts for service and disabled veterans will come to order. Let me read a quick mission statement from the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have the right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. Second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I'll make a brief opening statement, set the context for the day. The men and women of our armed forces understand that serving their nation in the armed forces as a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine is part of what citizenship is all about. The men and women of the armed forces take an oath that begins with, "I do solemnly swear," and ends with, "if necessary, with my life, so help me God." More than 40 million Americans have responded to that call and served their country in wartime. More than 1 million Americans who heard that call did not come home. Millions others have been gravely injured in defense of our basic freedoms. As long as the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, as the long conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan begin to wind down, thousands of service-disabled veterans are coming home. Today we have one of those veterans, Bill Pompolo, who has served tours of duty in both Iraq and Afghanistan. As if their personal challenges are not enough, these soldiers, airmen, and Marines return home to hard economic times and an extremely tight economy. The least we can do to support our wounded veterans is to ensure they have access to jobs and economic opportunities. Service-disabled veterans should have a level playing field in obtaining economic opportunity. This is the least we can do to provide for them. This basic obligation to honor their service and support them upon their return from foreign fields has been recognized since at least 1999. At that time, Congress passed legislation directing Federal agencies to place at least 3% of their contract spending with service-disabled veterans' small businesses. Unfortunately, almost no agency has come close to meeting this goal. The Department of Defense has a special responsibility to service-disabled veterans, but their percentage is also not close to 3%. President Bush directed executive branch agencies to do better by Executive Order 2000 in 2004. President Obama in 2009 established an interagency task force to improve capital access, business development opportunities, and goals for service-disabled veterans. As a quick side note, as a part of our request for information and testimony, this committee requested from OMB a person to testify about the progress of the President's interagency task force. Mr. Jordan has testified on these issues in 2009 before the Veterans Committee, but the Administration was unwilling to allow him to appear today to give an update on the interagency task force progress and the progress of this committee. This hearing is not a partisan issue or a single administration issue. We understand very well that the failure to strengthen and monitor the Service-Disabled Veterans Program is not unique to the current administration, but it is well past time to fix it. Agencies across the Federal Government are woefully behind in meeting their obligations to our wounded warriors. Several reports have documented an unacceptable level of waste, fraud, and abuse in the Service-Disabled Veterans Program. In too many instances, disabled veterans are cynically engaged to serve as fronts, so that companies and individuals can get access to contracts and business opportunities that are supposed to be going to wounded warriors. In other instances, charlatans pose as wounded warriors and steal valor, thereby siphoning off precious program resources. No honest American should stomach fraud in a program designed to help our wounded warriors. This waste and fraud hurts the entrepreneurship of our veterans by taking away the business opportunities available to eligible service-disabled veterans when the Federal Government purchases goods and services. The award of service-disabled veterans contracts to ineligible businesses reduce the funding available to eligible businesses and the accuracy of VA's reported socioeconomic goal accomplishment data. Examples of this fraud in this program are legion, but let me just give you one. A business received 1 sole source and 2 set-aside veterans contracts for duct cleaning and maintenance work valued at $343,500. Although the owner had self-certified his business as being service-disabled, the military system did not have record of him, and he had no disability rating. When the contracts were investigated, the disabled veteran stated he was in the Marine Corps for 5 weeks when he attended boot camp, but they had injured his leg during a pickup football game, resulting in his discharge from the military. These frauds take precious program dollars away from service-disabled veterans. The VA Inspector General projects that VA awards ineligible businesses a minimum of 1,400 veteran sole source and set-aside contracts valued at $500 million annually and could award a minimum of $2.5 billion to ineligible businesses over the next 5 years. Given VA's unique and special responsibility to veterans, these numbers are staggering. Today we have 3 distinguished panels to address these issues. First, we'll hear from the Honorable former Senator from Georgia, Max Cleland. Senator Cleland is a distinguished Vietnam veteran. Senator Cleland served in the United States Army during the Vietnam War, attaining the rank of captain. He was awarded the Silver Star and Bronze Star for acts of valor in combat. Senator Cleland has been a tireless advocate for the veteran community, and we welcome him here today. Next, we have Congressman Bill Johnson from the 6th District of Ohio. Congressman Johnson is himself a distinguished veteran and is currently the chairman of the Subcommittee of Oversight and Investigations Committee on Veterans Affairs. Congressman Johnson has been a forceful advocate on behalf of service-disabled veterans. Both these gentlemen will have a brief statement from them in a moment. We won't field questions necessarily from them to allow them to be able to make a statement for the record. We're very honored that you're here. Our second panel consists of the overseers. We have Assistant Inspector General Belinda Finn and Assistant Inspector General James O'Neill from the Veterans Administration Office of the Inspector General to discuss their recent report and audit on service-disabled veterans programs. We have Rick Hallman from the Government Accountability Office to discuss their recent findings on the scope of waste and fraud and abuse in these programs. Our final panel consists of veterans representatives and agency officials. We have Mr. Andre Gudger. Did I pronounce that correctly? Gudger. I'll get it right later, maybe. Mr. Andre Gudger, Director of the Office of Small Business Programs in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense. We also have Mr. Thomas Leaney, who is the Executive Director for Small and Veteran-Owned Business Programs at the Department of Veterans Affairs. And we have Mr. Rick Wildman, the Executive Director of the Vietnam Veterans of America, representing a coalition of veterans group called VetForce. And we have Mr. Bill Popolo, is that correctly? Thank you, who is President of Verissimo Global Incorporated, a service-disabled veteran, owner of a small business. Thank you all for being here today. The second and third panel we will swear in at that time. It is our habit to not swear in members of Congress or former members of Congress, former senators on that. Any other members will have 7 days to submit opening statements and extraneous material for the record. I would now like to welcome our first panel. Mr. Bill Johnson represents Ohio's 6th District, as I mentioned before. I would be honored to be able to receive your testimony today, Mr. Johnson.
Well, good morning, Chairman Langford, Ranking Member Conley, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today in support of our nation's veterans and service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, or SDVOSBs. I strongly believe that veterans are the segment of society that most deserves our sincere gratitude and assistance, and I'm grateful to the brave men and women who have and continue to serve our country. As a 26-year Air Force veteran who also serves on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, I am aware of the sacrifice and commitment that these brave men and women, in addition to their families at home, endure every day to protect the freedoms we enjoy as Americans. Due to advances in medical technology, more of our veterans than ever before are returning home, including many who may not have survived in the past. Now, that's good news. But some of these veterans are coming home severely injured with PTSD, TBIs, and sometimes with multiple limbs missing. However, you wouldn't believe the positive attitudes of these veterans I've met who have come home with such severe injuries. These veterans want to use their talents to lead meaningful lives despite their condition, and we owe it to them to provide the rehabilitation programs and support they need to be successful. Speaker Boehner couldn't be more clear when he stated last November, the men and women who wear the uniform of our armed services deserve our full support when they serve and after they come home, especially now in the middle of a tough economy. With 815,000 veterans unemployed, a number, by the way, that is far too high, our government needs to act immediately. I am deeply troubled that nearly 1 in 12 of our nation's heroes are unable to find a job after sacrificing so much for our nation. Contracting with service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses is just one way in which our government can act now to support these brave warriors. Compared to other government agencies, the Department of Veterans Affairs is considered to have the best SDVOSB program. According to the Small Business Goaling Report for fiscal year 2010, approximately 20% of the VA's contracts are going to these worthy veteran-owned small businesses. However, VA contracts only account for 30% of government contracting, meaning the vast majority of government contracts are not affected by the VA or their SDVOSB program. Currently, a mere 1.8% of Department of Defense contracts are with SDVOSBs. This is unacceptable. The Department of Defense trained these former warriors. They are tremendous assets to our nation because of the experience gained in our armed forces. It's time the DoD and other government agencies considered contracting at higher percentages with the SDVOSBs. The VA's SDVOSB program is by no means perfect. As Chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee on Oversight and Investigation, I chaired 2 hearings last year on this issue. However, I can say with certainty that the VA is attempting to produce positive results in their SDVOSB program. And be assured, I will be keeping track of the VA's progress to reform the SDVOSB program and streamline the certification process to better serve our veterans. Furthermore, I would argue that instances of fraud within the VA's SDVOSB program warrant a need for other government agencies to also take a look at their SDVOSB contracts. The fact that there are fraudulent companies claiming to be veteran-owned underscores the need to build stronger SDVOSB programs across our government to ensure that our nation's heroes, our veterans, are the ones receiving these contracts. I believe America would greatly benefit from contracting with more veteran-owned small businesses. Our service members and veterans are highly trained, skilled professionals with a solid work ethic. They have already demonstrated their abilities and dedication to our country. Why wouldn't our government strive to work with an increased number of these upstanding men and women? Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Conley, thank you again for the opportunity to speak on behalf of our nation's veterans and the need to assist service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. I am pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Senator Cleveland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I say that it's nice to be back in the People's House. 47 years ago, I was an intern across the street in the Longworth House Office Building in the summer of '65. I'm making progress. I'm now across the street here. So we're delighted to be with all of you and my friend Bill Johnson from Ohio. Thank you for focusing on this. I've had some time to think a little bit about what really is important to a disabled veteran. There are a lot of things that go on in your mind after the turbulence of getting wounded in war and then surviving it, and maybe spending the rest of your life trying to figure out why you survived. After the rehabilitation, after the VA services, after the voc rehab, after all that, we are dealing with young people who still have their lives ahead of them. Therefore, nothing solidifies the life of a disabled veteran like a job. It provides focus, it provides meaning, it provides purpose in living. And when one is so confused in many ways about why they survived, how did they survive, how did they get wounded, what was the war all about, then that job seems to provide the glue with which all of this seems to come together and make some sense and give some sense of direction. That is why I think that a job for a disabled veteran is really the key to that successful reentry into this country again. Now, we can't put the toothpaste back into the tube. We can't reverse the stream of history. We can't rewind the war backwards. We have to live in the present, but our disabled veterans have to live in the present and the future. And preparing for that, dealing with the present and preparing for that future is what they're all about. Nothing does that better than a job. I have thought a lot about what is most important, and that is the glue that holds it all together. So thank you for your focus on this issue. Thank you, Congressman Johnson, and all of you for focusing on this. And the incredible thing that Mr. Johnson pointed out was that these young men and women, what I like to borrow the phrase from my friend General Hal Moore, who said, you may not be a member of the greatest generation, but you're the greatest of this generation. So for the greatest of this generation, we owe all of our efforts toward providing them the opportunity to make sense of their lives. And nothing does that better than a job. And the amazing thing about it is that these young people, blown apart as they are, wounded as they are, sometimes mentally, physically, and emotionally, provide, believe it or not, tremendous leadership skills on the job, tremendous examples of courage and faith to other people around them. It just works that way. They seem to be strong at the broken places, to use a phrase that Ernest Hemingway, who was wounded in World War I, used in his great war novel. So I would like to conclude my remarks by just saying that, in the words of a World War II chaplain about disabled veterans, here's the way I see it. Out of cruelty, they learned compassion. From living in hate, they've learned love. From the loss of freedom, they've learned the love of freedom. They shall return not only eager to create a better world, what is far more important, they shall come back prepared to create that world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. You're always welcome. Be able to be here in the House as well. I'm glad to be able to have both your testimonies. I know we weren't fielding many questions on that. Let me just make a statement to both of you. Thank you for your service. As one of the people that has stood next to the parade clapping, I very much appreciate what you have done and what you have given for our nation's service on this. In my own city of Oklahoma City and the surrounding areas, there are many employers that pursue veterans when they come back because they do not know how to quit and they don't know how to stop until it is done. And so many of these veterans that are coming home in Oklahoma are coming home to find employers eager to be able to hire them because of their leadership and their great work ethic. And thank you for reminding Americans that that extends also to service-disabled veterans. The ranking member, would you like to make any quick comment before I dismiss this first panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do have an opening statement. I'll hold off with your permission until the next panel. But I did want to thank particularly Senator Cleland and Representative Johnson for being here. Max Cleland represents the finest tradition of service to his country and left an awful lot of himself physically back in Vietnam. But in terms of spirit, he's very much present here. And I think represents, as I said, the finest tradition of public service, both in the military and here in the Congress, to his community. We're honored with his presence. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a short recess and allow the clerks to be able to reset the panel for our second panel. Thank you, Representative Johnson. I'm going to yield for just a moment to the ranking member, Mr. Connolly, for a quick opening statement, and then we'll go directly to our second panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this very important hearing to review contracting policy for service-disabled veterans. I appreciate your attention to this issue, which is of critical importance to our nation's veterans. We have, in my view, a sacred obligation to support those who chose to wear the uniform. That support, however, does not end when veterans leave the service. We must do everything in our power to help veterans and their families transition back to civilian life. As the war in Iraq comes to a close and we begin to transition, we'll see even more veterans transfer out of the service, come back home into our respective congressional districts. After years of personal and family sacrifice combined with unique training and a willingness to serve, it's important to remember the desire of many veterans to continue to serve their country. In 2011, 27% of post-9/11 veterans worked for federal, state, and local governments, compared to 14% of the civilian population. In 2011, I hired a veteran of the Iraq War through the Wounded Warrior Fellowship Program to work in my office, and I'd like Joe Weirin to stand and be recognized for his service to his country. Joe's a Purple Heart recipient. His tireless work ethic and desire to elevate the voices of a new generation of veterans has proven an enormous asset in our community. Programs like the post-9/11 GI Bill passed by Congress in 2008 and used by over 500,000 veterans are essential in providing veterans the opportunity to contribute as civilians. I've seen firsthand the benefits of veterans who utilize the post-9/11 GI Bill at local colleges, universities, community colleges, and trade schools, and I know how important this benefit is, especially for younger veterans, in order to have access to educational opportunities and to compete in this troubling economy. After 10 years of war and with incredible advances in life-saving technology, we're seeing many of our veterans return with wounds both physical and emotional. These life-altering experiences, however, are not all created equal and should not be seen as a detriment to an ability to contribute in the civilian workforce. There is hope, however, and we know programs aimed at supporting our veterans are making an impact. The administration's efforts to lower veteran unemployment by providing hiring tax credits and securing private sector commitments to hire service members separating from the military are not only good for veterans, but actually good for our economy and for our respective communities. As service-disabled veterans begin to build their own small businesses, we must understand and improve their opportunity to become certified and to compete for governmental contracts. President Obama signed the Veterans Benefits Act of 2010 in October of last year. Section 104 of that law expands the VA's requirement to verify business status as owned and operated by veterans, service-disabled veterans, or eligible surviving spouses. This important piece of legislation helped ensure that no small business applicant may appear in the VA's vendor information pages, also known as VetBiz, and their website database unless it's been verified as owned and controlled by a veteran or service-disabled veteran. Furthermore, the Department of Veterans Affairs has met and exceeded goals for VA government contracts since the law was implemented in 2010. Although we have seen vast improvements after the VA implemented its review in 2010, some businesses found to be ineligible by the VA are still registering with the Federal Government in the Central Contractor Registration Database. We must improve verification programs throughout the government in order to prevent businesses from obtaining contracts after being found ineligible by the Department of Veterans Affairs, because when they do that, they take away opportunities from those who are eligible. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing for veterans who sacrificed so much for their country.
Thank you, Mr. Conley. We'll now welcome our second panel. Ms. Melinda Finn is the Assistant Inspector General of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. James O'Neill is Assistant Inspector General for the Investigations of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Mr. Rick Hillman is Managing Director of the Forensic Audits and Investigative Service Team at the Government Accountability Office. Ms. Finn and Mr. O'Neill, I understand that you all are sharing both have a written testimony that's been submitted. One of you will do oral testimony, but may both testify or answer questions. So I'd ask you both to be sworn in. If you would all rise, as you already are. Would you raise your right hands? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give this committee to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that all witnesses answer the affirmative. You may be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement, of course, will be made part of the record. You'll have a timer in front of you, which I'm sure you'll recognize the green, yellow, red on it, and we'll be honorable with your time, and thank you for being here. Ms. Finn, I'd recognize you first.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Langford, Ranking Member Connolly, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on our audits and investigations of veteran-owned and service-disabled veteran-owned small business programs. Although our work focuses on the implementation of these programs in the Department of Veterans Affairs, our findings and results have significance for other Federal agencies. As you stated, with me today is Mr. Jim O'Neill, the Assistant IG for Investigations in VA. At the end of fiscal year 2010, the Department of Veterans Affairs reported that it had awarded about $3.5 billion through its veteran-owned business contracting programs. Our audit of these programs found that 76% of 42 randomly selected businesses were ineligible for the programs and/or the specific contract awards. We projected these ineligible businesses received $46.5 million in contract awards. We projected that VA annually awards a minimum of 1,400 contracts valued at $500 million to ineligible businesses. This equates to $2.5 billion over 5 years that is awarded to ineligible businesses. Our results also throw VA's reported procurement dollars awarded to veteran-owned and small disadvantaged veteran-owned businesses into questions. VA reported awarding 23% and 20% of its procurement dollars to these businesses. We believe this could be overstated anywhere from 3% to 17%. These awards occurred because of several reasons. First, VA did not always review veterans' ownership and control of businesses thoroughly. Second, the VA contracting officers did not check the business's eligibility at the time of award and properly assess the subcontracting and partnering agreements to ensure that the veteran-owned businesses met program requirements for substantial participation in the work. We recommended VA improve management and program controls, enhance verification processes, and coordinate contract monitoring to reduce the number of ineligible businesses that received awards. VA has taken steps to improve its verification programs, both during and since our audit. The VA OIG, Office of Investigations, is aggressively pursuing allegations that ineligible businesses are misrepresenting themselves as veteran-owned and service-disabled veteran-owned businesses to win contracts. We currently have 88 open investigations and to date have issued 369 subpoenas and executed 26 search warrants. We recently won a conviction against the CEO of a non-veteran-owned business on charges of fraud against the United States, mail fraud, witness tampering, and making false statements. This business had received more than $16 million in VOSB and SDVOSB set-aside construction contracts from the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Army. 3 other investigations have resulted in the arrest of 6 individuals, and we anticipate additional prosecutions in other investigations in the near future. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. As I said earlier, we believe our findings have significance across the government, especially since the Department of Veterans Affairs is the only Federal agency that validates the veteran and service-disabled status of a business owner, as well as attempting to verify the veteran ownership and control of a business. Mr. O'Neill and I are here to answer your questions. We will be pleased to respond.
And look forward to those questions. Mr. Hillman.
Chairman Lankford, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the fraud prevention controls within the Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program, or the SDVOSB program. This program, established by the Veterans Benefit Act of 2003, is designed to honor disabled veterans' service by providing them with exclusive contracting opportunities. This program permits contracting officers to award set-aside and sole-source contracts to small business concerns owned and controlled by 1 or more service-disabled veterans. In fiscal year 2010, Federal agencies awarded $10.8 billion to SDVOSB, according to the Small Business Administration. Of this amount, the Department of Veterans Affairs awarded $3.2 billion, or approximately 30% of the government-wide awards. In prior work, we reported on weaknesses in the fraud prevention controls in both the government-wide program and VA's program. My testimony today summarizes the status of government-wide fraud prevention controls over this program and discusses our recent assessment of fraud prevention control improvements instituted by VA as part of its verification program. Regarding our first objective, our prior work has shown that the government-wide fraud prevention control weaknesses over the Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program leave it vulnerable to fraud and abuse. In October 2009, we reported on 10 selected firms that misrepresented their status as SDVOSBs, which allowed them to win approximately $100 million in SDVOSB set-aside and sole-source contracts. Cases like this happen because the government-wide program relies on firms to self-certify annually in the Federal Government's contractor registry that they are owned and controlled by service-disabled veterans, and most agencies do not validate this information. The firms have exploited the lack of effective government-wide fraud prevention programs using a variety of schemes, including setting up front companies to pass contracts on to larger, sometimes multinational firms ineligible for the program. Other firms receive contracts even though no service-disabled veteran was associated with the firm, or if one was employed, he or she did not manage or control the business. The primary government-wide fraud prevention control in place is SBA's bid protest process, in which interested parties can contest contract awards. In prior work, we found that the process lacked effective controls because firms could complete contracts even after SBA found them ineligible, rendering the process ineffective. In contrast to the limited fraud prevention controls for the government-wide program, the Veterans Benefits, Healthcare, and Information Technology Act of 2006 required VA to institute controls over its SDVOSB contracts. Specifically, the Act required VA to verify firms' eligibility and maintain a database, now called VetBiz, of the SDVOSBs it verified, starting in June of 2007. Over time, VA has made progress implementing a verification program for firms seeking SDVOSB contracts from VA. GAO testified in November 2011 that VA's program includes an initial verification process involving document reviews, site visits to contractor offices, and risk assessments for each applicant firm. In addition, VA has instituted a status protest process and a debarment committee designed to help ensure only eligible firms receive contracts and that ineligible firms face consequences for misrepresenting their status. Those improvements may help VA reduce the risk that ineligible firms will gain access to VA's SD-VOSB contract dollars. Nonetheless, GAO also made 13 recommendations to VA for improving its verification program and further reducing the risk of fraud and abuse. In particular, we noted in our November 2011 testimony that there was room for improvement in the area of debarments, since as of the date of that statement, only one firm and related individuals had been debarred by VA, but at the same time, VA had rejected 1,800 firms from further consideration as part of its verification process and had referred to VA's IG's office 70 firms for potentially fraudulent actions. VA generally concurred with our recommendations and stated that they have taken numerous actions to address the identified issues. To improve government-wide fraud prevention controls, we recommended SBA and VA coordinate with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy in order to explore the feasibility of expanding VA's verification process government-wide. However, agency officials stated that legislative changes would be necessary in order for Federal agencies to change the government-wide program from a self-certification process into using VA's BETVIS verification program. We also suggested that Congress consider expanding the VA verification program government-wide to employ more effective fraud prevention controls over the billions of dollars awarded to SD-VOSBs outside of VA's fraud prevention control process. While a bill calling for this passed the Senate last fall, no legislation to address this issue has become law. Chairman Lankford, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I'd be pleased to address any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you all for your testimony. I'd like to yield to myself for 5 minutes for some questions and conversation on it. How about that? 76% was the number I think that was floated of potential fraud, basically, that's out there of service-disabled veterans that they are not complete. Talk us through the elements of that. I know you mentioned in your testimony as well.
Yes,
if we're dealing with a number of 76%, that's a rather high percentage of potential failure in it.
Yes, sir, it is, and we were very surprised by the results. I personally was, anyway. Some of my auditors were a little more skeptical going in. We looked at 42 businesses in clusters across the country that we had selected randomly. We found 24 of those businesses weren't meeting the subcontracting requirements. Some of those were legitimate veteran-owned businesses, but the veteran business wasn't doing the work.
Correct, because the requirement is if you're a service-disabled veteran company, you have to have 51% ownership management, being a CEO or president type position. You have to lead the company. You can't just employ a service-disabled veteran. The service-disabled veteran is the leader of the company. Is that correct? Right. Okay.
And in any particular contract, the veteran-owned business, the business, not necessarily the veteran, has to complete over 50% of the work on that contract. In a construction contract, the veteran-owned business percentage requirement is only 15%, since those businesses, tend to rely a lot on subcontracting anyway. 16 businesses in our 42 didn't meet the eligibility requirements. Of course, in VA, it's pretty unique to find the owner not be a veteran, except for those two you mentioned in the beginning, and I can speak to those. But the veteran owner didn't meet the ownership or didn't meet the control requirements.
Is it the majority of them that you're finding, they don't meet the ownership or control requirements more than they're a veteran but they're not service disabled, or they're not a veteran at all?
We only had 2 in our sample that did not have service disabled status. VA had correctly identified that those businesses were not service disabled veterans. However, they didn't take them out of their database because at that time there wasn't a firm requirement to take them out. And so the businesses were still in the database, still bid for a contract, and were awarded a contract.
Has that been corrected now?
I believe that has been corrected. I know the requirement is now that they should be removed from the database.
Okay. Let me shift real quick, because the VetBiz is a big part of this and that database. If everyone government-wide is dependent on VetBiz, is that where we are at this point? That everyone kind of looks towards that, or where are we in the transition here? Because if I'm in a HHS situation and I have a service-disabled veteran that's applying, how can they verify when VA is the only one that's verifying all this? What's the process? Mr. Hillman, you want to address that?
Yes. Right now, the Veterans Affairs Department is the only department that is able to rely on a verified list of eligible veterans for the program. The rest of the federal agencies rely on a process that does not verify eligibility of firms, and they do not have a process in place currently to use VA's verified database.
So this is the self-certify. So if I go to HHS and say I'm a service-disabled veteran and I own this company and I want to bid for this contract, they just check I'm a service-disabled veteran, but there's no one checking with the VA that they are actually a veteran, that they're service-disabled, and then there's also no certification that they're actually the owner or main part of this contracting. Is that correct?
Yes. In the contractor registry, the firm itself designates whether or not it qualifies for certain types of set-aside or sole source contractors. Right. This is in a difference to other programs that have set-aside programs within SBA's 8A program for disadvantaged businesses, as well as the Hub Zone program for historically underutilized business areas. SBA controls the eligibility of those programs showing up on the contractor registry. That type of control does not exist on a government-wide basis.
So if SBA is verifying for everyone nationwide, all the different agencies, that this is like a female-owned business or a minority-owned business or an economically disadvantaged business ownership, is that correct? And then everyone else comes back and does that rather than a self-certification?
That's correct.
Okay, except for service-disabled. How do we connect the dots between these two then? So that so if someone is self-certifying, there is some way to use a Reagan quote here, to trust and verify, to be able to go back and say, yeah, thank you for putting that down. Let me verify you're actually in the system somewhere. How can we connect that, and why is it taking this long to connect the two?
In our earlier report, we made a recommendation that VA, SBA, and the Office of Federal Procurement Policy get together to look at the feasibility of extending the verification program that VA has instituted on a government-wide basis. In accordance with our recommendations, agency officials did collaborate. One of the important factors that they determined was that they did not have sufficient authority to require verification on a government-wide basis and to eliminate firms that weren't verified from consideration for these contracts without further congressional authority. We made a recommendation to Congress to consider implementation of VA's verification program on a government-wide basis. There has been a bill in the Senate to make that law. It currently rests within the House Small Business Committee for their consideration.
Great. That is part of this conversation today. See what we can do to be able to resolve those issues. Mr. Chaffetz, I recognize you for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think we're hitting on something that is troubling to me as well. Another subcommittee within the Oversight jurisdiction is also looking into this verification problems and challenges. And so I want to continue to explore that. It would strike me that even an individual company, should they want to go hire somebody, if they were to recommend or put on their employment application that they had served their country, they had earned certain medals, maybe they were a Purple Heart recipient, you would think there would be a way that they could go and verify that through the process. And I'm unaware of something that would be crystal clear, simple to use, accurate, and swift in its processing. If you were going to apply for a job and you were saying that you had achieved certain medals, you had served in the military, maybe you were disabled, maybe you had achieved a Purple Heart, or had a Purple Heart, that you could get that verified. Just like if you said, oh, I earned a BA at a certain university, you could call the university and get a verification for that. I think it's inexcusable that we don't have a system in place thus far. You mentioned some of the companies that they had pursued, very few of them. What is the penalty for those that have actually gone through the process, the adjudication process, and been found to be wrong, what is the penalty for misrepresentation?
Sir, if we're lucky enough to conduct the investigation and get convictions, the criminal penalties can be years in prison for fraud associated, depending upon the charge that is they're indicted on. Now, in terms of suspension and debarment, VA can, under virtue of 38 U.S.C., I think it's 8127, can debar these companies from doing business with VA. Under the FAR Part 9, that debarment could be spread across government, and that's actually in play now with a number.
And that's just not for the companies, but that would be for the individuals as well associated with that, or is that not the case?
The individuals are individually debarred as well as the companies.
And how many debarments have we had so far? I think we said the number earlier. But
I don't know. We've referred, in every instance where we've got a complaint and arrest warrant, we've referred that individual and the company for suspension and then upon conviction for debarment. We've initiated 2 recently fact-based debarments where there was no interest in prosecution, but we believe we made a compelling case for debarment.
But there's so few debarments that are actually happening. I think, as the Chairman pointed out, the discrepancy. Why is that, Mr. Hillman?
The VA does have a debarment committee that they established in September 2010, and to date there have been 3 debarment actions involving 11 firms, or associated firms or individuals. There are also several proposed debarments that are pending. That is in stark contrast to the nearly 1,800 firms that the VA has rejected from their verification program, and some 70 firms that are associated with potential fraudulent activity that have been referred to the VA's IG's office.
So why the discrepancy in the number? I mean, what's slowing them down? Do they meet once a quarter and they only have a half hour, or what's the problem?
They do meet on a regular basis. They're not full-time staff. They're part-time staff. The historical information suggests that much more can be done from an enforcement standpoint, both by VA and the Small Business Administration, to better ensure that there are consequences associated with fraudulent activity.
And you've looked at this a lot closer than most. Why are they so slow and so inept in actually following through on this? I mean, statistically, I don't think inept is a strong enough word. What's slowing them down? When you say they meet regularly, is that every week, every month, every quarter?
On a periodic basis, I believe at least monthly.
Monthly? What's slowing them down? Why aren't we creating this database? I mean, we're having the same problem overseas. This continues to be a theme, a problematic theme for the Department of Defense. So we go through this same process with contractors overseas, and we see billions of dollars leave our shores to go to people who didn't provide services that they're supposed to. And now we're having it happen right here. What else needs to be done other than trying to do the job that they're already set up to do?
We have 88 cases open right now on SDVOSB fraud. Our template is to seek prosecution first, criminal prosecution. If that's declined, then to seek civil prosecution. And then, if that's declined, to refer for suspension and debarment. We believe that the penalties of imprisonment are going to deter this behavior very effectively as we get more and more prosecutions, which are increasing and gaining traction within DOJ.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I would hope and encourage them to not only pursue, there should be concurrent pursuit of not only criminal but also debarment. We should err on the side of making sure that we're giving these contracts to those who truly deserve and should be awarded those. And I find the statistically their follow-through on this is inadequate at best. And yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chaffetz. I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Issa, for his time of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I missed our first panel. Certainly, Senator Cleland would be a good example of somebody who has paid the price and then had a hard time getting here and a hard time staying here. It's not easy for veterans anywhere, including in Congress. I'm concerned, as Mr. Chaffetz was, that your order is wrong. And let me ask a series of questions, maybe, since we're one of the committees that could change that order. First of all, Mr. Hillman, this part-time debarment sort of question and so on, should this committee look at reorganizing government and how it does business to professionalize the whole question of contractors across DOD, SBA, you name the ABCs, including veterans? Would that help if, in fact, we turned it into an efficient, effective, well-staffed organization that, in fact, like a corporate headquarters, was your go-to for, I've got a problem, their job is to quickly get the bad guys out?
I believe it's definitely a resource issue and something to consolidate those resources and provide for the expertise to look on a government-wide basis. The credibility of these kinds of actions to ensure that there are real consequences would be beneficial.
And Mr. O'Neill, I appreciate the order that you gave us. Honest testimony is always critical to a starting point of sometimes disagreeing. When a police officer witnesses a crime, he doesn't view conviction as the first step, does he? He views arrest as the first. Isn't suspension and debarment, and particularly suspension, isn't that in fact an essential first step when you have enough to administratively know that someone's a bad actor, whether or not you have the criminal? I mean, obviously, if you convict somebody of a felony, it ain't no big thing that you manage to debar them. If anything, when you convict somebody of a crime, the question I have for you is, when you convict them of a crime, shame on you if you only get the guy that did the crime. What's your procedure to debar 1, 10, hundreds of people who were not convicted but were conspirators, unindicted co-conspirators in the effort? In other words, the executive secretary, is she or he being debarred because they clearly had knowledge and aided and abetted in it even though they're not convicted? That would be my question to you, is if you're putting debarment, suspension debarment at the end, then shouldn't it include a broad group of people that wouldn't have been picked up in the first round?
I think the reason for the order, sir, is frequently the prosecutors don't want to have to disclose information gained in the investigation. And some of these investigations are conducted under grand jury secrecy. So the movement towards immediate suspension, debarment of the individuals to be indicted presents a problem in that area. In terms of...
But this committee, just a few years ago, saw a fraud being perpetrated in Florida where an individual was selling 30-year-old, 35-year-old 7.62 rounds to the American people to be put in the hands of, I think it was the Afghan government, and thus we were giving them rounds that probably didn't fire. Would you have suggested that you wait until you finish the indictment before you stop the shipment or the purchase of those?
No, sir, of course not.
So how do you stop the bad if not for suspension?
Well, as we...
Do you have the tools to stop before, in fact, this other part which may have significant delay? But certainly Mr. Chaffetz made it pretty clear that, 3 versus 1,800 sounds like debarment is almost an irrelevant part of your tool chest based on how often you use it.
Well, I believe the Department pursues debarment independent of us when we're not conducting the investigation that could lead to an indictment. So the numbers are in that arena, not in our 88 investigations per se.
Well, back to Mr. Hillman then. Do we have the order right? Do we have the tools? And how do we explain so few suspensions and debarment?
On a government-wide basis.
Well, we're sort of looking at wounded warriors access. This is a little bit narrow in this, but go ahead and answer government-wide.
Well, on a government-wide basis for service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, the fraud prevention framework to help deter and detect fraud and abuse is woefully inadequate. We looked at prevention controls to help to ensure that only eligible firms for this program are provided with these contracting opportunities. We looked at monitoring and detection controls to help to ensure the continued eligibility of firms to be within this program. And we looked at the enforcement and investigative powers to help to ensure that there were real consequences associated with individuals who claimed to be eligible but were not. In each of these three broad areas of the fraud prevention framework, the government-wide service-disabled veteran-owned contracting program needs serious improvement.
Well, my time has expired, but Ms. Finn, if you could answer just one question or two questions. Do you have, I'll answer it for you. You do not have subpoena authority.
The IG does have subpoena authority. I would have to go to our general counsel, but we have subpoenaed documents and other audits.
Is that an effective tool for you when you are able to get it?
Yes, it is an effective tool to obtain documents. The threat of it is also, effective, that we can use a subpoena.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask for an additional 30 seconds?
Without objection.
Could you elaborate on how effective the tool of threatening, in other words, the fact that you can get a subpoena, how often does that cause voluntary compliance at a sufficient level to your satisfaction?
To be honest, sir, I don't have to use that very often in my work. I mean, as auditors, we're looking at internal controls, and we identify fraud indicators, and then we turn them over to Mr. O'Neill for investigations. But the IG has statutory authority to obtain information. And at the end of that, the IG, can report, of course, to you and as Congress that we can't get into information within the department. That generally is enough authority. The subpoena comes into question when we are dealing with people outside of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Is that the findings of all of you, that the power to get one is an effective tool to get compliance in most cases?
We find it an effective tool. Whether I would venture towards getting compliance, it's hard to say. It is very effective to use a subpoena. Of course, we don't have subpoenas for testimony, but for documents and so forth, it's very useful. And, of course, we get search warrants from the court to gain even more information.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognize Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hillman, in your exchange with my colleague from Utah, you cited the inadequate resources as one of the problems we face here. Could you elaborate on that? I mean, what would it mean if you had more resources, I assume, in the form of personnel, in terms of either preventing ineligibility in the first place and or recovering, assets given to ineligible firms in the second place?
The SBA bid protest process is one good example where the program itself sees itself as one of its primary responsibilities providing concrete information on the eligibility status of individuals. That is what they see as a material outcome from their efforts. What we're hoping to see is that when entities are determined to be ineligible, that there will be real consequences associated with those actions. In the SBA bid protest world, there have been very limited to no suspensions or debarments associated with the decisions that they have made, and sometimes contractors are continued to be allowed to maintain those contracts through their completion. That does not sound like a system to me that affords real consequences when entities are determined to be ineligible.
Would it be fair to say that an investment in additional resources in this particular area actually might save taxpayers money?
Absolutely. If there is a sense that there is an aggressive posture within the program to ferret out the potential fraud, waste, and abuse, you're going to eliminate the interest of a lot of bad actors from entering the program. That's not only going to help to ensure that the honored service-disabled veterans are receiving the benefits that they're entitled to, but it will also help to ensure the overall control structures are operating effectively.
Thank you. Ms. Finn and Mr. O'Neill, I need you to speak closer to that mic, please. You're a very quiet Irishman. Thank you. What percentage of the ineligible firms you've identified could fall in the error rate column versus the willful fraud column?
We only pursue an investigation when fraud is indicated. Ours, we don't launch an investigation.
Okay, so 100% of what's on your plate are already in that fraud column.
Yes, and then when we discover that it is an error, then we end the investigation.
Okay. And what percentage of your investigation ends in that kind of conclusion?
Well, we've closed 25 cases to date. 20 were unsubstantiated. 3, there was no prosecutorial interest, prosecutor interested in pursuing it, and then there was administrative remedies in 2. So 25, and we have 88 open investigations this time. So 20% perhaps, maybe, if the math is correct. But the question earlier, most of this fraud involves, that we encounter because of VA's controls, now focus on pass-throughs or rent-a-vet schemes where the work and the money goes to a non-service disabled veteran, but there's a service disabled veteran fronted as having ownership and control of the company.
And that's willful fraud.
And that is willful fraud.
But I guess I'm trying to get at, as the Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee here, what's the extent of our problem? How much of this is error? I thought I qualified. VA thought we qualified. We didn't have our paperwork in on time. You got it wrong. I mean, versus, no, I deliberately set out on a scam to qualify for something I most certainly am not qualified for, and you caught me.
I believe that Mr. Lenny will testify that, if I'm not mistaken, 1,800 firms have been denied certification, and that they almost all of them are a result of perceived errors because they've reported.
But not fraud.
A conflict. Yeah, not a fraud.
Right. Ms. Finn, Mr. O'Neill's plate's already predetermined. I would ask, would the Chairman indulge me 1 extra minute?
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. Thank you for his courtesy. Ms. Finn, you do the pre-sorting. What's the balance we ought to be thinking about in our heads about, suspected willful fraud versus everything else at work?
We had found 32 of our 42 businesses had issues. Within that 32, another 9 had circumstances that seemed suspicious enough for us to refer those to Mr. O'Neill's organization. And I believe those investigations are still ongoing. I'm not certain.
But it sounds like, as the Chairman was pointing out in terms of suspension and debarment, and frankly, what the statistics you just gave, Mr. O'Neill, in terms of prosecution, doesn't sound like a very vigorous effort, which one of 2 things is true, if that's an accurate impression. The case was so weak as to be a judgment call, or we're not all that aggressive in making sure that compliance is strictly adhered to, and when we uncover somebody who's deliberately gaming the system illegally, we prosecute them with the full extent of the law.
Well, I can assure you that actually considerable effort is devoted to investigating these cases.
I know, but I'm also, Mr. Chairman, forgive me, but I'm interested in the next step, Mr. O'Neill. What happens then? You read off a string of statistics that was not very encouraging in terms of what are the penalties. You said that the number of people just declined, I assume the Department of Justice, declined to prosecute. That suggests a weak case.
I think I only said that about 3 cases out of a total of approximately 115. So the numbers of declinations hasn't been that high at this point. And frankly, there is much more interest in the Department of Justice in pursuing these investigations now because of 3 appellate decisions that say that the loss is the full value of the contract, which impacts sentencing and fines and so forth. So we actually are seeing it, and I believe you're going to see an increasing number of prosecutions as early as this month.
That's heartening. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. And I want to underscore what Mr. Hillman pointed out, though. As we're having a political talk about let's shrink the Federal government by 5% or 10% in terms of workforce, strategic investments in certain parts of the Federal government in terms of personnel can have huge return on those investments for the taxpayer. This is one example. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. And I recognize Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the work of the panel, not only preparing here today, but your work and for the very important work you do on this issue, which I think is of importance to many. Mr. O'Neill, I'm interested in following up a little bit on the practice that we currently see with regard to your investigations and the numbers of declinations. As a former Federal prosecutor, I appreciate the reality that there are many cases out there that oftentimes merit some measure of prosecution, but the reality is limited resources, and so often the declination guidelines are quite high, and it's very frustrating for organizations like your own. Can you explain to me where you see those declination guidelines right now, what the shortcomings are in having prosecutors evaluate these cases and actually find some way to consolidate perhaps a group of them and make some kind of inroad in this area?
Well, in each case, we find that we're educating a prosecutor who may be new to this particular type of set-aside fraud. So, but we're getting a lot of traction because in October of last year, DOJ sent guidance to the supervisory AUSAs and the U.S. attorneys themselves about the issue of the loss as the contract itself, and that helped gain a lot of interest. If we had a separate group of prosecutors, say like antitrust, or that would be certainly perhaps easier in some way because we wouldn't have to go through the education process that we do when a prosecutor first encounters one of these types of investigations.
May I make a suggestion? There may be something that ought to be done. I think, as with anything, communication on this in the Winston Churchill mode to make a point and then make it again and to make it again and to pound it in an institution. There's an organization called the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. It's comprised of about 16 sitting United States attorneys. They meet at least on a monthly basis, and they go back and they consider policy of the Department of Justice, and then they take a role in implementing it. Now, you have 16 of the top United States attorneys sitting at a table along with the leadership of the Department of Justice. They'll generally meet for about 2 days, maybe even longer. And there's a window of time to request to get on their agenda. I think something that would be helpful, notwithstanding the guidance they send out to the field, because as the recipient of that guidance, we would get tons of materials each day from Main Justice, and somebody would take it and press it down. Making your case to this group about the importance of looking at these cases and then the opportunity to do something else. The Department will consolidate cases from around the country and then try to make a statement by doing a number that are coordinated and effectively done at the same time. It's not my place to tell DOJ what to do, but I, having been there, believe that you could be effective at making this internally appreciated and then also effective at perhaps advocating for one of those in which you've already done the investigations. You have the material sitting on the desks of these prosecutors it's not a big reach to go back and look for the best of those cases. Can I ask one other question of the panel? Why is the Department of Veterans Affairs doing a fairly decent job of at least meeting their goal of 3%, and some of the other critical agencies, HHS and others, sort of so woefully behind? What do they do well that the other agencies don't do to meet their 3% requirement?
I think the issue is focus. When we were looking at the Department's implementation of Recovery Act contracts, the Department had about $1 billion to spend. They really focused on competing those contracts, which was a departure, but that's another hearing, and also making awards to service-disabled veteran-owned businesses. So it was a big focus, and I think that's the key difference.
I would also add that the focus on the part of the Department has been tremendous in helping to ensure that the goal is being met or exceeded. I would also say, though, that congressional support to help to ensure that the agencies are making progress in this area is essential. The Veterans Affairs Committee required the VA Department to establish goals that were higher than the government-wide goal and to exceed that goal. And with the congressional attention in that area, VA has stepped up to the plate. Continued aggressive oversight of agencies' actions in this area will also hopefully help the rest of the Federal agencies to increase their focus.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
Thank you. Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to ask our panel first, we've talked a lot about the U.S. Attorney and the Federal Government investigating and processing. Is there a way we can streamline this to where there's some sort of the private sector can do more, or the veterans themselves can do more? It's my understanding that in most cases, outside the VA at least, a violation of these provisions, basically your only option is a bid challenge. I mean, is there any way we can take this off of the plate of the Federal Government and effectively enforce these provisions? And I'll open that up to anybody who wants to answer it.
Well, from a government-wide service-disabled veteran-owned small business program standpoint, you're absolutely right. The only major control is SBA's bid protest process, where eligible individuals can protest a decision that has been made. We found, though, that process is woefully inadequate and ineffective in having real consequences associated with individuals who are found to be ineligible. One of the critical areas that I believe could help to ensure that the SD-VOSB program has reduced amounts of vulnerability to fraud and abuse would be, in addition to looking at the opportunities in the investigations and prosecution areas, to look more at the preventative controls to help to ensure that ineligible firms do not enter the program in the first place. And the best preventative control that exists today are the processes underway and under development and being implemented within VA to verify the eligibility of firms' participation in this program.
I mean, you're going to have to, I'm a little bit concerned about the speed at which the VA operates within, any of their programs. In South Texas, we're really facing a situation where veterans are having problems just getting the basic medical benefits with payment delays to providers of up to a year now, millions of dollars owed to providers. And we hear overall how the VA is trying to streamline this and streamline that. And I know, Mr. Hillerman, you've looked at some of this from a past basis, and our other witnesses are directly involved. I ask again the big, broad question: what's missing there? The people who work for the VA ought to get up every morning proud that they are serving the people who served us, and be just working their tails off to get this taken care of. But all we hear out of the VA is tale of delay after delay and problems getting these programs implemented. Would anybody like to comment on that? I didn't mean to editorialize here, but I just get frustrated sometimes with this.
Well, you're absolutely right that the program, Congressman Johnson just testified in the first panel that it's far from perfect. There is a lot that the VA has been doing to help to improve its processes, and there are a lot more that needs to be done. One of the major areas that we've seen is in human capital, the extent to which the Department has the resources, both full-time VA employees as well as the expertise through contractor resources to deliver on the promises that they're making in establishing a verification program. We also see a need for more emphasis to help to ensure that once firms are verified, that they remain eligible for the program. And additional steps need to be taken there on the part of VA to help to ensure the re-verification of firms that were previously.
Is it just personnel, or are we not implementing technology effectively or rapidly enough to help with some of these tasks?
Technology is a big area as well. We currently within GAO have an engagement underway to look into the technological capabilities of the VA. They have improved a lot of the manual entry activities in the past, but more needs to be done.
Anybody else wish to comment?
The VA has used some technology to obtain documentation from veterans as part of the verification process. Unfortunately, what we found as we visited these businesses is it's very easy to make your documentation appear that the veteran owns the business. You know, that's not a problem. But you have to be in the business there to really figure out that the veteran's name is on the paperwork and his name is on the door, but he hasn't been in that office since the business started.
Shame on businesses that do that. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be delighted to yield time to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
you.
Further
Questions.
Let me just do some follow-up and some closing questions for us as well. And thank you, Mr. Walberg, for yielding in that. This is one of those things that's an idea. That's a great idea. How do we come alongside companies run by service-disabled veterans? I think it's a great thing for our nation to do, and I'm proud that we're doing it. It's the implementation where we're having the struggle. If we have a company that puts a service-disabled veteran on the list, provides documents, and says this is where they're in leadership, this is where their name should be on the door, but you actually get to the company and find out that's not true, that's intentional, willful fraud. That is putting a person's name out there and then trying to deceive to be able to get a contract. If you have a person that is not a veteran that is stealing the valor and going through some other agency and they're self-certifying but it's not being checked and verified, once the word gets out, you can get these contracts and the self-certification is not checked, it just starts ramping up with the bad actors in the process. So we've got to figure out how to go from idea to implementation. This doesn't seem to be as much of a manpower issue as it is a connect-the-dots issue, if you'll allow me to make that illustration on it, and trying to figure out how do we connect the dots. So my calling on this would be for our CIO, the Federal Government, for OMB to start working on some coordination to how do we start coordinating these different agencies and technology and to find out how we can take the information that VA uniquely has and get that certification out. But the challenge comes to VA to say, how do we certify people without making it such a high standard that the good folks can't get in? Or they wouldn't bother to say, I'd love to apply for all those, but the red tape is so long, I'm not going to mess with it. It's not worth it. So then it's only the bad actors that jump in that have the processes to be able to jump in and get it. So I know it's a unique balance that y'all are going to have to be able to work through the process on so that we do have legitimate service-disabled veteran-owned companies to be able to get involved in this. But we do keep the bad actors out. As you're already finding out, there are folks that are getting through the cracks at this point. Debarment and suspension, I think, is a good first step. I think that is something that we should engage as fast as possible. That begins to exclude people quickly because that gets out to all agencies. While an investigation may take quite a while to happen, they're still continuing to pick up contracts in other agencies, and to get the word out. So we've got to have some way to be able to get that message out to all agencies that has been suspension and debarment through our system. So we've got to figure out a way to be able to flip this system. I know as they're investigating, they don't want to leak out all the investigations that are going on before they're done, but there has to be some intermediate step so that we can get the information out and start slowing the movement of all these individuals to it. So this is going to take some coordination that we're going to count on OMB. We're going to count on other individuals from GAO and others that will come together and say, let's start taking some of these recommendations that have been made and the good work that you all are doing in VA, and thank you for your service for all of you in this process, and to figure out how to be able to move it from here. One quick statement, though, and this is just for anyone to be able to make a comment on. There have been several steps that have been made, and you had mentioned earlier, Ms. Finn, about VA has taken steps to improve the verification process on that. I look forward to reading through some of those steps and to seeing where that ends. What is your perception of how we start coordinating multi-agency on this? Taking the certification that's happening in the VA and the steps that you're doing to improve that, and then to be able to move it. Because, as we mentioned, when it's suspension and debarment, it's not a high standard. You don't have to prove criminal intent to even get to suspension and debarment. You can do that quickly and start getting the word out and work on the criminal side of it. But it's not just the certification, but it's all of this. Getting the suspension and debarments out there, getting the investigations, getting the certifications. What's the best way that you see to start coordinating these things?
I think the best first step is to do whatever needs to be done, whether it's legislation or coordination through OMB, to be able to share VA's VIP database and information on verified businesses with the rest of the Federal Government. Right now, as we've all said, the rest of the Federal Government is trusting on the business to self-certify their status, and that doesn't work.
Right. We need to verify that with our trust. Okay. Other comments there?
It's clear that the government-wide program lacks preventative controls, lacks detection controls, lacks enforcement and investigative controls. These three combine to make the program a real candidate for bad actors. The VA, SBA, and OFPP have gotten together to look at the possibility of expanding the VetBiz program on a government-wide basis. They say they need legislative authority to do so. Moving the VetBiz program on a government-wide basis is likely the best solution available today to ensure that eligible firms are included in the program.
Okay. Thank you for that. We will continue to progress with that. And again, thank you for the work that you're doing, and for the work not only for this hearing, but the work you're doing all the time when the cameras are off as well. So we very much appreciate your dedication to service for our nation. With that, I'd like to take a short break as we reset for our third panel.
Thank you.